Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I am the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. On behalf of Third Place Books and our partners at Brazos Bookstore, who we're very excited to be working with tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conversation between George Henson and Daniel Saldaña Paris. The subject of today's discussion is Sergio Pitol's The Love Parade, which is an early novel by the master Mexican writer translated by George Henson. First of all, I just want to invite all of you to use the chat window at the bottom of your screen. Say hello and let us know where you're calling in from. And I just want to add that one of the few, I think, silver linings of a pandemic is that bookstores across the country are now better positioned to support international literature and bring authors, like Daniel and translators like George into the Zoom conversation, and it also allows us to partner with great bookstores like Brazos in Houston. I am unbelievably excited to be working with Ulrika Motz and Mark Haber at Brazos, a store that is often at the center of Latin American literature translated into English in this country. So Brazos Bookstore has a stellar virtual event series, and I do want to put a quick plug for the Brazos Book Club, which is a unique virtual book club that often features independent presses and uniquely includes the presence of the author of the book in discussion. So I will be linking to their virtual event series later tonight. So as I mentioned before, the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. You'll also see me in the chat window posting where you can purchase The Love Parade. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. George Henson is a translator of contemporary Latin American prose and a 2021-2023 Tulsa Artist Fellow. His translations have appeared in many leading journals and magazines, including Granta, the Paris Review, World Literature Today, amongst others. His 8 book-length translations include Cervantes laureate Elena Poniatowska's The Heart of the Artichoke, Luis Jorge Boone's The Cannibal Night, and of course, Sergio Pitol's The Art of Flight, which I have here, The Journey, The Magician of Vienna, and the collection of stories Mephisto's Waltz. And now, of course, The Love Parade. He is currently working on Taming the Divine Heron, the 2nd volume of Pitol's Carnival Triptych, of which The Love Parade is the 1st volume. George currently teaches Spanish translation at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. Joining him in conversation today is Daniel Saldaña Paris, a novelist, essayist, and poet, calling us today from his home in Mexico. He is the author of the novels Among Strange Victims and Ramifications, both published by Coffee House Press and translated by Christina McSweeney. His collection of personal essays, Planes Flying Over a Monster, is forthcoming next year, and Atessa Moshfegh has called him the Mexican Philip Roth. Tonight's discussion will center around The Love Parade, which is an early Pitol novel published in 1984, recently translated into English and published by Deep Vellum in Dallas, Texas. It's a truly unique book in Pitol's body of work, and in my opinion, very much unlike Pitol's later work, in the sense that there's a bit of a detective bent around it amidst a sea of glassy realism, I think. So curiously enough to me, the New York Times actually included it recently in a roundup of mystery and detective novels, which is perhaps the best testament to Pitol's slippery and eccentric relationship with genre, just as his trilogy that begins with The Art of Flight is undefinable as fiction and criticism in history. So without further ado, let's get this conversation started. Please welcome George Henson and Daniel Saldaña Paris.
Thank you very much. Daniel, I'm going to defer to you and let you begin the conversation, if that's okay.
Of course, yes. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm very excited to be here with George discussing Pitol's The Love Parade, which is a favorite of mine. And I'm very glad to be joining you from Cuernavaca here in Mexico, just an hour away from Mexico City. I'm wearing my typical guayabera from Veracruz because Pitol was from Veracruz. So there are a couple of things about the book, and then I'm gonna let George say some more stuff about it, and then maybe we can have a little chat. And so I have some questions prepared for you, George. And at the end, you can all well, during the whole thing, you can submit your questions through the Q&A, and at the end, we're gonna address them as thoroughly as we can. So The Love Parade is Sergio Pitol's second novel, and it's considered the first book of his Carnival Triptych, which is also composed by Taming the Divine Heron, which now we know George is also translating, and La Vida Conyugal. I don't know what's going to be the title of that one, probably Marital Life or something like that.
Married Life.
No? Married Life. So this is the first book of the trilogy of the Triptych, and it was originally published in Spanish in 1984, which incidentally is the year of my birth. And it won the second edition of the now prestigious Herralde Prize, which was later won, for example, by Roberto Bolaño's Savage Detectives and some other famous books of the Spanish-speaking world. So it was a very prominent display for book. And it tells the story of Hian. I'm just gonna set it out for you without spoiling the plot too much, just so you know what we're talking about. And The Love Parade tells the story of a historian, Miguel del Solar, who has returned to Mexico after living abroad in England for a while. This is the early 70s. And as he passes by a building in Colonia Roma, a building which you can, by the way, see right there behind George in his background. As he's passing by this building in Colonia Roma, where he lived with some relatives when he was a kid, he recalls the story of a party that took place in the building in 1942, where a foreigner, a German citizen or an Austrian citizen, we don't know, was shot dead. So this historian gets a bit obsessed with the story of the killing, of the murder that took place right there. And he later discovers some documents that also mention the incident. And so he decides to investigate what happened. So there's, as we already know, there's an element of mystery in the plot. There's a detective element to the novel. And this historian, Miguel del Solar, will try to figure out what happened in 1942 in the course of the party and afterwards, after the party. So with this aim in mind, he will make up a book that he's supposedly writing about that year, meaning he's writing a book, he's supposedly writing a book about the year 1942 and about how the World War II impacted the Mexican society and how the Mexican farming and different aspects of Mexican life in 42. So with this cover story, he proceeds to interview several of the old tenants of the building. And little by little, he uncovers a messy comedy of misunderstandings and entanglements through each interview. So it's a very interesting structure to me because the novel is organized through the interviews that he makes with the old tenants and the old witnesses of the case. And each interview is a chapter, more or less, a chapter of the book. And in a way, these interviews are also monologues because he really doesn't talk that much. The narrator, well, not the narrator, the character, Miguel del Solar, poses a few questions and then he leaves the interview. The other guy talks for pages and pages. So we read these monologues as almost speeches, and Miguel del Solar barely says a word. This is a literary form that will also be used by Pitol later in Taming the Divine Heron, for example. And maybe, I think it's something that maybe he learned or he took from one of his favorite authors, which is Robert Musil, the very famous German-speaking author, who does something similar in The Man Without Qualities, as we all know. And I think there are many details in which The Love Parade reminded me of The Man Without Qualities in this most recent reading that I did. I mean, it's a very different tone, definitely. We are hearing, we find ourselves in front of a novel, a detective novel almost, and also a very humoristic novel, but it has some of that structure of the speeches where each character presents himself through a very long speech where he displays his philosophy and his viewpoint around the world. So, but obviously in Pitol, this resource is employed in the sake of humor mostly. So in The Love Parade, the narrator depicts also like different social types and makes fun of them. It's also a social commentary in many ways. Please, George, feel free to interrupt me if you think I'm saying something wrong, because I mostly just say the things that I found, but you are the main reader of this book. I mean, the translator knows more than anybody else. So,
well, no, you're doing a wonderful job. In fact, I'm very pleased that you're doing such a great job, because I cannot summarize this novel as well as you are. I become too bogged down in detail when I begin to talk about it, but you're doing a wonderful job. Please continue.
Okay, so yeah, I thought it was a good idea to have just a general view of the novel before diving in.
No,
so
go ahead.
Sorry, I was saying that the narrator also depicts different social types, and in a way he makes fun of these social types. But what is very interesting to me is that the characters are more than mere representations of an economic class or a decadent elite. No, each one has an eccentricity of their own, and that's what makes the book so enjoyable. Far from a pedagogic critique of society. I mean, it has some commentary, some social commentary, but the characters are not only a function to that commentary. They are also rich in the construction, and they are very eccentric, each one in a different way. One of the things that I also love about this book is that I believe it's also a work of literary criticism in a way. No, Pitol often does something similar to one of the characters who is interested in literature and in the history of literature. In this case, the German character Ida Werfel or Ida Werfel. Pitol talks about a certain kind of literary drama that was prevalent in the Baroque, called the Comedia de Enredos, which would be something like a comedy of misunderstandings or something like that. And in this kind of drama, there are constant impersonations, disguises, misperceptions. And Pitol, after having talked about this particular genre, about this historical novel, this way of writing in the Baroque, in the Spanish Baroque, he proceeds to pay tribute to it also in the book. So he's constantly talking about the literary picaresque as well. He talks a lot about Tirso de Molina and about El Quijote in a very, not in a frontal way, but he talks about the picaresque. And it's one of the subplots of the book. You can find different references to the history of the Spanish literature, and especially to the picaresque. And indeed, we find many of the qualities of the picaresque, of the historical picaresque, in the Love Parade as well. So Pitol, this book has several levels of reading. You can read it as a detective novel, but you can also read it as a work of literary criticism, where he's reenacting, in a way, some of the characteristics of these old genres from the Baroque period of time. And we see it particularly with a character called Martinez, which is a fascinating character and is probably at the center of the novel. It's an elusive character, which he never speaks in the book. He's already dead by the time during the narration of the story. But he's clearly a pícaro, meaning he's like this rogue character who comes from a lower social class and is always led by his ambition. And throughout the book, this character, this is one of the characteristics of the picaresque novel, the pícaro never changes, or not substantially at least. No? We see him at the beginning of the book and we see him at the end, and he's pretty much the same character. There's no dramatic arc, at least in what has to do with him. So it's very interesting to see how Pitol is constantly making references to the history of literature and paying homage to the tradition, while at the same time updating these resources and using them to criticize the Mexico he lived in, which is the Mexico of the 70s and 80s. And in a way, this is a strategy that we can trace outside of Pitol's work in a broader way in many Latin American fiction authors of the 20th century, I think. When I read the Cuban Severo Sarduy, he talks about something called the neo-Baroque, which is exactly that, is the idea that you can refer to the history of literature and that any masterpiece of contemporary literature has to contain its tradition as well, a commentary of the tradition. So that's the idea of the neo-Baroque, would be that there's a sort of fold within the book, and this fold contains the critique or the commentary of the tradition that gave birth to the very book that you are reading, which is a very convoluted way of writing, but we can find that in many Latin American authors throughout the 20th century and even before the 20th century, I would say. So, for example, when you read Borges, who is making constant references to the gaucho literature of the 19th century, or when you read Margot Glantz, who is a contemporary and good friend of Pitol's, she establishes a dialogue with Sor Juana or with Melville. This is a very common way of not making up, but like asserting a tradition of one's own. So I feel that, a way Latin American literature went to say we are a part of world literature in many ways. No, we can dialogue, we can establish a dialogue with all of these traditions. But in Pitol, something very interesting is that this is not a scholarly amusement. No, it's also a detective novel. So you can read it at all these different levels, and you can also follow just the investigator, the detective who is set out to solve a crime. The twist here is that the crime took place 30 years prior. And therefore, the detective is also a historian. And this is what takes me to the next thing I wanted to say, which is this is a hilarious novel. In many moments, you find yourself laughing out loud while reading, because it's truly humoristic. And I think it's because of the use of time, because Pitol knows very well the formula of tragedy plus time equals comedy. And so he sets the crime in the past, 30 years prior. And now the detective, when he's trying to investigate the crime, he finds all of these idiosyncrasies. Each character has forgotten a lot of things, and everybody's just making up things as they speak. So it's a very funny book in that sense, no? The crime took place during the Second World War, and Mexico at the time was a nest of spies. We had a lot of Nazis here in Mexico who were spying for the Nazi regime, of course. And so the historian at the beginning, he thinks that the crime has to do with this, with the world stage at the time, no? So he thinks that maybe one of the witnesses or the victim of the crime was a Nazi, or somehow related to the Nazis. Actually, here in Cuernavaca, where I'm currently at, there was a huge group of Nazis, and they actually attacked Pablo Neruda when he was a consul here in Cuernavaca. This is an anecdote, has nothing to do with the book, but I recently read about it. Pablo Neruda was in a restaurant here, and he was suddenly attacked by a group of Nazis during the World War II. So that was the whole ambient, the whole scene in Mexico and in Mexico City, of course, during the war. So in the novel, after 30 years, every witness hates the other witnesses. So every character hates all of the other characters. And this is very funny because they all had 30 years to really deepen this hate, and every one of them is very eccentric, as I said, and very funny in his own way. We have people like, it's also, I mean, the book is also like a microcosmos of the post-revolutionary Mexico, no? And the building itself, the building works like a metaphor, a microcosmos of Mexico as a country and as a whole, where you have old fortunes suddenly diminished by the revolution, the new elite of the revolutionaries turned government officials, the patronizing foreigners who come to Mexico fascinated with its folklore. And then you have the intellectual milieu, which is always petty and opportunistic, and everybody's like really mean to each other. And I think it's really interesting because in a way, Pitol, something that fascinates me is that Pitol always includes the foreign vision of Mexico in his books. I mean, he was obviously Mexican, but he lived many years abroad. He was a diplomat, and he lived in Russia, in the Soviet Union at the time, in Poland, in Rome, in Barcelona, in many places. And so he always had this external vision and the foreign vision around Mexico. And he includes that in the book in a very clever way, in a very subtle way. And I think that's also something very interesting about this book. So I don't know, George, if you want to take it from here and maybe say something, and then I have a few questions for you.
Wow, Daniel, I don't even think I can follow that. That was so wonderful. I mean, I learned things from you that I didn't learn reading and translating this novel. So thank you very much. And please forgive me for having turned off my camera a few times. I am at my niece's house in Oklahoma. So I've moved from Monterey to Oklahoma to begin my fellowship, and she has cats. And so there was a cat loose in the bedroom, and I had to finally get rid of it because those of you who know cats, they decide that they want to be where they want to be. Yeah, I'm going to start with Pitol actually wrote this novel abroad. He wrote it in 2 different countries, and I think he finished it in Prague. His last diplomatic post was as ambassador to then Czechoslovakia. So yeah, he spent 20-something years in the diplomatic corps. But Daniel is exactly right about his looking at Mexico from the outside, because he spent 27, 28 years outside of Mexico. And to a certain extent, for a very long time, he was a forgotten Mexican author. And he published his books originally, or his novels at least, outside of Mexico. As Daniel said, this was published by Anagrama. He was good friends with Jorge Herralde, and this won the 2nd Herralde Novel Prize. So yeah, he was, even to a certain extent, a foreigner in his own country. In The Art of Flight, he talks about needing to go back to Mexico to connect with his roots, because he had been outside of Mexico for so long. And if he was going to write about Mexico, he needed to be in Mexico. He said he needed to be around the language and hear it every day. I just found out today, actually, that Pitol at one time lived in this building for approximately a year. And I think it was probably one of those periods where he was living primarily abroad, but he returned to Mexico for a short period, and he lived in this building. Well, I don't even know where to go from here, Daniel. As I said, that was so wonderful. And so thank you very much. I first met Daniel. This is actually the first time we've seen each other face to face, even though it's virtual, because I translated an essay that he wrote about Pitol when The Art of Flight was being published, a beautiful essay. So it's in LitHub, and Daniel calls Pitol a total writer. So I invite you to look for that essay in LitHub. It's a wonderful essay. Well, I think what I'm going to do now is, you mentioned how some aspects of this novel are funny, and you're absolutely right. And so if you're not laughing where you should be, then it's my fault. It's not Pitol's. I will take no credit for this novel whatsoever. If you love it, it is because of Pitol. If you hate it, it is because of me. It was a very difficult novel to translate. The one thing that Daniel didn't mention was Pitol's indebtedness to Bakhtin. He was a devotee and to some extent a student of Bakhtin. And so, as he mentioned, I think there are 12 chapters in this novel, and each one is an interview with a different character. And as Daniel said, he doesn't do a lot of talking. He asks some questions, and he lets the interviewee speak. And so in this regard, this is written in multiple voices. So to a certain extent, you could say that this is a polyphonic novel. And that was one of the challenges in translating it. I mean, I believe that, the translator's main task is to find the voice of the novel. But this novel has multiple voices. I mean, there's the narrator's voice, there is the protagonist's voice, and then there are each of these characters that represent different ages, different classes. And so to a large extent, each of their voices are very different. And so that was one of the challenges for me. But there are a lot of funny things in this novel. I mean, there's a 19th century, what is presented as a 19th century Mexican castrato who ends up not being a castrato. I mean, like, how could that not be funny? But I'm going to read a section from, I think it's chapter 6. You'll have to forgive me because I'm one of those people now who has to take off my glasses to read. This is the interview with the character named Pedro Balmoran, who is a very eccentric character. Pitol plots out his novels very far in advance. And he begins writing about his plans to write this novel in 1980. And if you haven't read The Art of Flight, if you haven't read anything by Pitol, I suggest you begin with The Art of Flight. And because he talks about all of his works, all the things he's written. So he begins to talk about writing this novel in 1980. Pitol kept very exhaustive diaries. And so in his trilogy of memory, which are all, I call them literary memoirs, they kind of defy classification, but he includes his diaries in the trilogy of memory. So he begins to talk about this novel, The Love Parade, as early as 1980, and then it's published in 1984. So I'm going to read from, it's like, what am I going to read? Picking something to read is very difficult for me. I mean, I could read the first page, which describes this building which he calls the Minerva, which is called the Rio de Janeiro. I'm a professor, so I have to do lots of research. So today I did research on all different kinds of things, and one of them was on this building. Even though I've been there a dozen times, every time I go to Mexico City, I go by it. It was originally called the Parque Roma. It was built in 1908, and then it was changed by Jose Vasconcelos, who was a famous Mexican intellectual, entre comillas, but also I think at one time the Minister of Education during the Revolution. But he changed it to the Edificio Rio de Janeiro because he liked how country Brazil had treated him. And so he decided to rename this building after Brazil. So the first page, if you read the first page, Pitol situates the novel describing this building. And you can read that and decide if I do a good enough job describing the building. But it is one of the most characteristic or emblematic buildings in Mexico. By the way, I don't know if Kit is here, who is the cover designer. I can't help, this is actually a drawing. Kit, who is a wonderful translator, an artist who lives in Mexico City, he went and sat in the park outside this building and hand drew it for the cover, and he did a wonderful job. But I'm going to read from, I think it is chapter 6, and it's called, the title of the chapter is Who Sings and Dances. And I'm choosing this for two reasons. One, because it's a rather humorous episode, but also because of the difficulty in translating. There's an expression in Spanish, el que canta y baila. So if you say, oh, are you Pedro Balmoran? El que canta y baila, which means he who sings and dances. In English, we'd say something like the one and only, right? So when I first started translating this, I thought, okay, I'll just translate that as the one and only. But then I realized that it was an essential part of this character. And so I had to leave he who sings, or the one who sings and dances, or who sings and dances in the text. I had to make it work. So this is Miguel de Solar, the protagonist historian who has gone to interview Pedro Balmoran, who is an eccentric character now in his 60s, still living in the building in 1972, but he lived there during the murder that takes place, which involves a party that was given by a socialite, and he was at the party. And this is a very eccentric man who is like a bookseller. So anyway, I'll just start. He, Miguel de Solar, got up after jotting down a few cryptic notes in his notebook. He crossed the street and entered the building. He stopped at the entrance in front of the directory to look for Balmoran's apartment number. Once he found it, he went up to the top floor. The cheap apartments are on the top floor. He found a hunchback man in his 60s, a gaunt face, his hair cut almost to the scalp, his head too big for his rickety body, which was little more than a heap of shriveled tissue tied in knots. On his face, a kind of lump protruded from his nose. His right side was an array of deformities, a shrunken leg, the foot twisted inward, an immobile arm, a dead hand resting on his chest over his heart. His body's puniness hadn't prevented the growth of a pear-shaped belly. At first sight, the invalid gave off a look of filth, but after a few minutes, that effect disappeared. His village-cut clothes were as clean as everything in his apartment, which was larger than he imagined those on the top floor of the Minerva to be. Miguel de Solar was struck by the somber, contracted, discordant charge that the battered body emitted. The hours he spent there formed a chain of tedious and irritating moments made bearable only by his patience and interest in the case. What a flowering, what a jungle, what yawning roots of megalomania, frustration, and resentment. An element of exaggerated contrivance made his monologues intolerable. A repertoire of grimaces, winks, silences, and dramatic pauses, accentuated by the incessant nervous twitch of his left hand, seemed to anticipate the importance of a phrase about to be uttered that always resulted in unbearable banality. From time to time, he'd repeat the same refrain, the undersigned, Pedro Balmoran, the one and only, who sings and dances tangos, the one and only, who sings and dances the most enchanting waltzes in the world, the one and only, who sings and dances the frenetic mambo. Hadn't aged, didn't feel his age, didn't even know how old he was, wasn't bitter, practiced happiness as if it were a daily exercise in health, when the truth was, it would be difficult to imagine such an atrocious image of decrepitude as his, a vision of man transformed into a mere sack of bile and resentment. The historian showed Balmoran one of the copies of his chronicle of 1914. He tried to provide a sense of research. He explained why he was proposing to write a book about 1942. Cruz Garcia had recommended that he consult him about the bibliographic possibilities of the subject. He was interested in obtaining the foundational books on the Mexican radical right, the Cristero novels, for example, and the political literature disseminated through the sacristies. He needed his advice on these topics. He'd been told that during the period he conducted extensive literary and journalistic activity. He would be very grateful if one day he would allow him to consult his work. The bookseller listened to him without any pretense of friendliness, but rather distance and condescension. At first, he seemed only to measure the business relationship he could establish with an eventual customer. He said that in a few days, he would formulate a small bibliography and would then see what he could find for sale and for what price. He made his way to the interior rooms covered with shelves and filing cabinets. Everything in the house, except the occupant, had an exacting professional appearance. There were no dusty books, no yellowish newspapers piled on the floor or stacked on the furniture. It was obvious that he was well organized. He showed him some expensive editions of questionable taste that compiled texts by European travelers in Mexico, illustrated with 19th century images, and clarified that his main task was to prepare those editions for a club of bibliophiles. He commented sarcastically that Cruz Garcia refused to recognize him as a colleague and referred to him instead as a used bookseller. Because in his youth, that is, at a certain point in his life, because he refused to acknowledge ever having stopped being young, in difficult times, he'd been engaged in the business of buying and selling rare books, especially old editions of Mexican literature, a task he continued to perform, as was evident, as an ancillary, almost vicarious job. This is actually the character, Pedro Balmoran, I would think probably the most eccentric character in the book, who thinks he's found a book about the 19th century castrato, whom he believes really existed, who turned out not to be a castrato at all. And so anyway, the whole episode about the castrato is actually also very funny. Daniel, I'm going to turn it back over to you, or I will just engage.
I love the passage. I love the passage you chose. It's really good and it's beautifully translated.
Thank you.
Really in awe of what you've done, because it's a really difficult task to translate this prose, and also the nuances between all of these characters. You said that each character has a very distinct voice, but also I would say none of the characters, I mean, in the book, there's barely any imitation of orality. The characters, they don't talk, they don't imitate the orality of the Mexican, of somebody who speaks, not in Spanish or in any language. I mean, the syntax of the speeches is that of a written discourse in a way. Wouldn't you say that? Because I feel that, I mean, even though it's true that there's something Bakhtinian about it, and it's a polyphonic novel, these characters, the way the each speech is structured is very written. It's not like an out loud speech, rather like a written speech. So I wanted to say what was the main challenge in translating these different voices, which are not exactly voices, but rather ways of sharing the language in a very complex way.
Well, actually,
what's in general, would you say, what's like the main challenge?
I would agree with what you said, and because there isn't a lot of orality, because there's not a lot of dialogue. So in the little dialogue that we see, there is to some extent orality, but these are, Pitol was obsessed with as a diplomat. He talks very often about the language that diplomats use, and he hated diplomatic language. He hated very overblown or stilted language, or in Spanish, rimbombante and altisonante. Sometimes I can find the words in Spanish, but I can't find them in English. He hated that kind of language, and because one of Pitol's frequent uses in novel is parody. He loves to parody this kind of excessive language. So what I just read is actually all the narrator, and so you're right. It's a written discourse. There is a lot of exposition in this novel, and so but it is written in a very high register. So Pitol is, even though he parodies this language, he writes in a rather high register. And so I want to make sure that this voice of this very educated man, and Pitol, Pitol was very well read, Ignacio Sanchez Prado, who is a professor at Washington University, who is a Pitol scholar, comments, Pitol was a cosmopolitan, not because he read Joyce. We don't call people cosmopolitan because they read Joyce, because everyone was reading Joyce, but because he was reading people like Flann O'Brien, when only 200 other people in the world were reading Flann O'Brien at the time that he was published. But these authors from around the world that no one was reading at the time. And so Pitol translated 6 Henry James novels. And he began reading as a young boy in the 1930s in Veracruz. And he was reading these 19th century novels from his grandmother's library. So he began his literary tutelage by reading 19th century authors. And so I can remember, for example, I would write something and I would translate something, I'd put an adjective and a noun together, and I'd think, God, I've never seen this collocation in my life. And then I would go and put it in Google and it would come up in a Henry James novel. And so, or some other 19th century novel.
That's amazing.
So I knew that I was
incredible.
Capturing his voice. I see Spencer is joining us because we are running over.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, please finish whatever you're saying.
I knew that I was doing the right job, or choosing the right lexis, because besides his syntax, and his syntax is very difficult and convoluted, very 19th century, his lexis is also.
Yes.
So I wanted to make sure, how many different synonyms can you have for a scammer, right? And so, I used ngram a lot, which if you're a translator and you don't use ngram view or viewer, please start using it, because you can look to see how frequent a word was in 1950 or between. And I would go into ngram viewer and I would put this collocation, this adjective and a noun, in between 1940 and 1970 when this is taking place, because I wanted to know if these words were being used during that time. I didn't want anachronisms, for example.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. I mean, because we often think about the investigation that a translator has to do in terms of history or references or yeah, like the things that the author talks about, not in terms of the way he uses language. And
right.
I find this really, really fascinating. I mean, the fact that you could trace some of his expressions to some of the authors that he translated himself and the authors that he revered and he read.
Well, he also likes to hide literary allusions and references from works that he has read, and maybe 2 or 3 words. But for example, in Taming the Divine Heron, I found a reference to the third policeman. And, for example, it's one of the nouns I could have translated a dozen different ways. But once I realized he was alluding to the third policeman, I had to go to the third policeman and look up and see what word Flann O'Brien used. Because then that intertextuality becomes lost. And he's very tricky about that. Like I said, just 2 or 3 words. And I'm sure I missed more than I caught. But I felt like that I
love this, because that's a feeling that I have, that I constantly have as a translator, that I've lost many of the references and the allusions. And it happened to me when I was translating Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children archive into Spanish, which was called Desierto Sonoro in Spanish. It's also a novel full of references and allusions. And I had like the same impression that I was all the time catching some of them and maybe losing others. And it's fascinating because we take some time in it. I mean, it really, you have to go to the source and you have to really find the exact passage and then use some of the words, but not exactly the whole passage, because maybe it doesn't fit quite right if you put the whole passage, but you have to leave the allusion. So it's really fascinating, these tiny works of the translator, and some of them, nobody really knows that you are doing that, which
exactly.
is heartbreaking in a way.
Well, and it's worth mentioning that Pitol was a prolific translator from many different languages, and he was a very free translator. And when I was translating The Art of Flight, for example, I had to buy more books. I mean, I acquired about 30 books because I couldn't find it in Google Books. I couldn't find the passage or in the inside on Amazon. And so I had to just buy the book and track down the language. But he would translate things so loosely. I would say he's playing fast and loose with his translation. And it's like, okay, the existing English translation of this is not what you said, Pitol, but Pitol would do it to make it work. In order to make it work where he needed it to work, he would translate it however he needed to. And if you use the existing translation, then it didn't work. He actually does that in one place with Margot Glantz, with one of Margot's, his good friends, novels. He pieces together parts from different parts of the novel, and the English translation just doesn't work the way Pitol needs it to work. I mean, if there's an existing translation of something, I use the existing translation. But in that case, I had to do my own translation, not because the translation wasn't good, but because it wasn't working the way Pitol needed it to work. Spencer.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you both so much for this conversation, and I really appreciate that we've gone kind of in the direction of the intertextuality of translation and what goes on behind the scenes. That's always my favorite part of these conversations. But yeah, I'm here to usher in audience questions. So if you have a question for our speakers tonight, feel free to, again, submit those to the Q&A window. So our first question is from Andre, who says, Pitol mentions in The Art of Flight that Onetti, Borges, and Carpentier were his three literary pillars who helped establish his literary life. Do you see any of their influences in The Love Parade?
I'm going to defer to Daniel on that. These are names that come up continuously. I don't know Onetti's work enough.
That's Juan Carlos Onetti, yeah.
And I've only read a couple of Carpentier's novels. I mean, Carpentier was, many believe to actually have started magic realism, although he didn't refer to it as magic realism. But these are all writers that Pitol, especially Borges, Pitol was reading Borges as a young man. His style is very much different than Borges. I think here I said I was going to give the question to Daniel, and I'm taking it. His style is very different than Borges. If anything, I mean, he loved Borges's detective novels. Pitol was a consumer of detective novels. He very much appreciated the genre, and most of these that Pitol wrote with Bioy, and they wrote under a collective pseudonym. He likes how Borges reinvented Spanish literature, and he, like many people, he thinks that there's a before Borges and an after Borges. He loves what he did, for example, in The House of Austerion. He said it completely changed not just Latin American literature, but literature. But stylistically, I don't see a lot of Borges in what he was doing. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's more of Carpentier in the style of Pitol, because Carpentier is also the beginner or the starter of the neo-baroque. It's like very excessive, and the prose is very convoluted, very long sentences. And I would say that the style resemblance in Pitol's, at least in The Love Parade, is closer to Carpentier than to Borges. But I think that some of these assertions, I mean, when he talks about Onetti, Carpentier, and Borges as being the main pillars of his literature, is something that probably came later, because The Art of Flight is a much later work. And I think at this point, when he's writing The Love Parade, he's probably not as influenced, especially by Onetti, because I don't see any Onetti at this point. I think Onetti is clearly there in his memory triptych, The Art of Flight and The Journey and The Magician of Vienna. But these earlier books, which are more humoristic and in a way, he's still playing with the genres. He's still playing with the idea of how a novel is structured and how the detective novel works. And he's not as far into the blurring of the genres as he is later in his life. So I think probably Onetti came later. And here he was reading a lot of foreign literature. He was not very connected to the Latin American scene at this point. I would say he's reading a lot of Eastern European authors. So yeah, probably Musil, Witold Gombrowicz. You can find a lot of Witold Gombrowicz, the Polish author, in his work at this point. And you can see some of the Cuban authors. So Carpentier would be around there. Carpentier and maybe, I don't know if Sarduy or some of those early 20th century Cuban authors. For sure, Onetti yet. I think that's a later influence.
He was also very indebted to Alfonso Reyes. And so I think he shares a lot of Reyes's prose style. Reyes, he actually attended unofficially Reyes's classes in the 50s when he arrived in Mexico City to go to university. And he praises Reyes a lot, especially his prose. So I think he probably has a great debt to Reyes, but also to Henry James, as I've already mentioned, and these other writers. I mean, he was translating from English, Russian, Polish, Italian, Hungarian. I'm sure that he was actually probably doing a relay translation, not translating directly from Hungarian, but he was reading all of these international writers. And I think that he says in The Art of Flight that he learned to write by translating. He actually was writing some stories in the 50s and 60s, but he was doing much more translation. And so he says he owes a debt to translation and for learning how to structure a novel. And so he was reading all these greats, these masters of the novel, and he borrows something from all of them.
And George, a relay translation is it's a translation of a translation, correct?
Yes.
As opposed to like translating directly.
I'm convinced that Pitol didn't read
Hungarian, right. We have another great question from Mark at Brazos. He says, George and Daniel, it's wonderful to see both of your faces. My question is more of a general one. How is Sergio Pitol looked upon today in contemporary Mexico? Is he simply considered a classic author, or is he also considered sort of cool to read? Just wondering how Pitol is seen in Mexico today. Congratulations, George, and thank you, Daniel.
Well, I really am going to defer to Daniel on this, but I'm going to preface it by saying, I think a lot of the interest in Pitol among the younger generation is thanks to writers like Daniel. When I discovered that Daniel was a Pitol fan, I was very thrilled to translate his essay. In fact, I've translated 2 essays about Pitol. And I reviewed his novel Among Strange Victims, and I called it almost Pitolian, which he considered to be a compliment. But I believe that, especially around the whole notion of mistaken identities, it's very Pitolian. But Daniel.
Yes, of course. So I think, yeah, he's not a very popular author among my generation, I would say. But he's very influential through some other authors. For example, Mario Bellatin, who is one of Pitol's, he was a very close friend of Pitol's, and he's also published by Deep Vellum, by the way. Mario Bellatin, you can find I think they published Beauty Saloon recently, or not?
Yes, a retranslation.
So a retranslation of Beauty Saloon. So Mario Bellatin, who is a very influential writer in Latin America in general, he's a very good reader of Pitol's work. And also Vilamatas, who's not from Mexico, but he's very influential in Mexico and in Latin America in general. Vilamatas was a very, very huge fan of Pitol's work, and he has a book called Lejos de Veracruz, which is an homage to Pitol in a way. But I would say that I don't know, I have a very somber opinion of what's trendy to read in general and in Mexico in particular, because it's strange, like nobody really reads old authors. I mean, there's a lot of like recent authors that are amazing and are great, and I really enjoy them, but you have to also look back and read some of the old stuff. And I think Pitol hasn't really been very popular in the recent years. But I think, I mean, the right people absolutely read Pitol's work.
Well, it was through Valeria Luiselli that I discovered Pitol. I knew who Pitol was, and I think I probably even read a couple of his short stories in graduate school. But it was the article in Granta that Valeria Luiselli, it was a series of the best untranslated writers. And, you know, it's terrible, absolutely terrible that Pitol had not been translated. Before I translated The Art of Flight, I think there were 3 or 4 short stories that have been translated to English. And so now
that's incredible.
Yeah. So now I've translated 5 books. I have 7 books under contract. So I've just turned in Taming the Divine Heron, and I'm going to start on Married Life. So that will be 7 Pitol books. And he has 2 other novels, which, you know, who knows, maybe I'll get to translate those as well. But, you know, Pitol, especially for someone who loved more British literature than American literature, but also American literature, to not have been translated into English, I think probably hurt him, because he'd been translated into French, German, Italian, and how he escaped not being translated into English until the 21st century is really a puzzle.
But I think only recently, like the English-speaking market, and especially the US publishing industry, has been recovering authors from Latin America, like, and also translating contemporary authors. Like 10 years ago, it was really rare to find a translation from the Spanish-speaking world into English, and especially in the US, it was really, really scarce. Like now I see there's like a boom of Mexican and Latin American authors, mostly contemporary, but some recoveries as well, like Pitol. And I think that's amazing. I mean, that's really important, because I think you cannot really understand the contemporary authors unless you are familiar with some of the authors that we grew up reading as well. So for me, it's more important to have Pitol or Poniatowska or Margot Glantz or Amparo Dávila. There's also many great female writers from Mexico that only now are being translated and who are really important to us. And I think you have to read some of them to really understand the new voices of Latin American literature. So it's great that the independent publishers are doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Will Evans at Deep Vellum, for being committed to Pitol from the beginning.
Yeah, and a special
The Art
shout
of
out also to Sarah and Walker on their publicity team who we worked with to put on this event. They are so good at their jobs. I love them dearly. And this couldn't have been possible without them.
And you, Spencer, in Third Place Books, and Mark at Brazos, who's been my greatest cheerleader and one of Pitol's greatest cheerleaders as well.
Well, thank you both, George and Daniel. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I want to encourage everyone to go out, pick up a copy of The Love Parade, or of course, Pitol's other novels, and also, of course, Ramifications. This is a wonderful book. I've loved it since it came out in 2020 in English. Yeah, I think that is our show for tonight. Any parting words before we hit the close button?
Yes, please buy Daniel's books. Christina McSweeney is one of my favorite translators. She really is.
Yeah, she's
yes,
the best.
yes, she's wonderful.
Thank you all. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good night, everyone.